Well, where we stopped at the end of the second series of pictures and commentary about my excavations in Greece, we ended with the work in 1957, where I had both Pylos and Lerna on that year. And then there was a gap of a number of years because Patricia and I returned to the United States in the summer of 1958. We both taught at Florida State University, and we were caught up in all the processes of completing our educational careers. So, at any rate, the biggest topic I had to work with immediately was the question of my dissertation. So, Patricia and I and little boy Kevin went back to Greece in the summer of 1562 when we had already transferred to the University of Illinois from Florida, and I was still trying to complete the dissertation. So we went back to Greece that summer and spent the summer there going to various museums and checking the various ceramic evidence that I needed to complete my dissertation, and it was completed, it was accepted, and I got my degree then in 1963. The big problem with my dissertation, of course, was the fact that it was under the direction of Blagan to begin with, and I had a definite outcome I was supposed to reach, and I reached the successful outcome that he wanted, namely that the professor at the University of Missouri was wrong. But on the other hand, I also discovered in my research that Blagan had been wrong. So I couldn't very well get my dissertation approved. But Blagan, I was the last dissertation he directed, the last PhD in his time as chair of the Department of Classics. And right in the middle of the final process, he handed over the reins to John Caskey, the director of the American School, who returned to take Blagan's position at University of Cincinnati and was then the supervisor that completed my affair. But to add to the difficulties, while he accepted the fact that I had challenged Blagan's conclusions about stratigraphy, he couldn't let me use his evidence from Lerna, which was the evidence I needed to show that Blagan's stratigraphy needed to be corrected. So for these reasons, my own dissertation disappeared into a black hole because it neither was approved by Blagan nor was it providing the evidence that I needed. So at any rate, I got the degree anyhow, and went and was on the staff at the University of Illinois, where Patricia also was teaching, and she also had a position in the Dean of Students, Dean of Women's, as it was then called, and she was in charge of the married students. So this was our situation after we made the move from 1961 until 1966. In those years, I hadn't been back to dig, but in 1966, Blagan wanted me to come back to continue digging tombs at Pylos. So that summer, I left Patricia and our two children, infant and little boy, behind in Champaign-Urbana while I went to dig with Blagan. Towards the end of my work there, all of a sudden I received a cable from my mother which said that Patricia needed me at home and I was to return as swiftly as I could. Fortunately, I had completed my major work, and I had to leave somewhat abruptly and to change my travel plans in order to come back as quickly as I could. I got back to discover the problem. Patricia had irregular heartbeats, and when she would have such an episode, it absolutely terrified her, and she needed me to be with her whenever that happened. And I realized after coming back in 1966 that my days as a field archaeologist were probably over. I could not leave her behind to go off and dig in a summer, which was the normal pattern for married archaeologists. Either the male or the female spouse was left behind while the other went off to do the digging. So This was the situation. In 1966, I had reached that stage, and I got the job at McAllister starting in the fall of 1966, and they were to give me, in lieu of the sabbatical I missed by changing jobs, they were to give me a semester off at full pay. So I took it in 1968 and went off to Cambridge with the family, where I started to prepare for ordination in the Episcopal Church. And that's where the story picks up again. And I'll try to demonstrate how this happened. At any rate, the next excavation was the one we call Nicoria. The University of Minnesota had for years, not receiving an excavation permit, but Bill McDonald, the professor in classics at the university, had sponsored a survey of the Messenian region down in southwestern Greece, which is on your map right now, where you'll see the red arrow pointing to that southwestern section of Greece called, ever since antiquity, Messenia. So Bill had been working down there on a survey of various possible sites, and lo and behold, along in the end of 1968, he received a permit to begin excavations the following year. So here is the map which shows the arrow pointing to Messenia, the area that that he'd explored, and its relationship to Kalamata and Athens and so on. But here's a more detailed plan of the area, with Messenia on the left and Sparta on the extreme right, separated by the huge mass of Mount Taygetus, the major peak in that part of southern Greece. And the map will show you there Carpophora, which was the site for this new permit. They also built a dig house, and here on this plan you can see where it is. It's south of Carpophora, on the road that leads from the highway that connects Pylos and Kalamata down to Koroni at the southern tip of that peninsula. At any rate, this was where we were headed. We were going to dig on the hilltop of Carpophora, and we were going to have our excavation headquarters where dig house is marked south of the site. Not too far away, but too far to walk. We had to normally drive up in a Jeep or something like that, Land Rover, to the excavation. The view from the dig house is across the Gulf of Messenia to Mount Taygetus in the background there, and to Kalamata, again, the largest town in Messenia, which is right at the foot of Mount Taygetus on the Messenian side. This talk is to demonstrate the difference between the excavations I'd done before and this one. It's a difference between old archaeology and what has been called new archaeology. In old archaeology, where we're basically following the patterns of Heinrich Schliemann, the great man or great woman, as the case may be, with a few graduate students or assistants helping them, with very little scientific support. The new archaeology is quite different, as I will clearly try to point out now. But I can point out one of the differences that we introduced, and that is, for the first time, we were coming as a family to an excavation with children, which heretofore had been unthinkable. So we had to start off from Minnesota with the new car we had bought in 1968, the Volkswagen Camper. Here you see it at our motel the first night out from St. Paul. We stopped at a motel we were familiar with because the route is the same we take to our island property. And here are Mara and Kevin outside the motel. We're loaded up, ready to depart the next morning. We were headed to Montreal, where we had booked the camper and ourselves on a Canadian Pacific ship sailing for Liverpool. We discovered that it was very inexpensive to take a car over and back. I think it was $400 round trip for the car, cheaper than it was for the passengers on board. So what we would do is we would camp on our way to Montreal. We would land in England, and then we would camp our way all the way down to Greece. And then at the end of the excavating season, we would have our Volkswagen camper loaded onto an Italian ship, the Cristoforo Colombo, our favorite steamship that made the transatlantic crossing. And it would leave from Piraeus with our ship, with our car and us on board, and head off. We would stop at Naples. We would stop at in Messina, in Italy, in Sicily. We would stop at Malaga. We'd stop at Lisbon. We'd stop at Halifax before we finally docked again in New York. And then we would drive our Volkswagen back to the United States, with a stop usually at our island at the end. So this was the change that being a family involved in excavation immediately introduced in our life, in our lifestyle as it is. We had to leave and take the kids out of school early in order to get there in time for the excavation to start. We usually left in May. The earlier the better. Usually before Memorial Day, we would be on the road heading to Europe. Here in the slide of our first summer, 1969, the excavation house is under construction. And immediately you'll see not only us with our tent under the tree over there and our camper, but also a much bigger excavation facility than in any of the other sites that I had dug at. It immediately illustrates the major difference, one of the major differences in the new archaeology. Whereas before, when I was working for Blagan, there would be 3 or 4 of us in the excavation house. Now we had a staff of something like 27 to be accommodated in the excavation house. The difference, all of a sudden, we had all sorts of specialists. We had an in-house photographer. We would have a botanist, a paleobotanist. We would have a physical anthropologist. We would have a physicist. We would have a geologist. We had a whole host of scientific specialties represented in carrying on the excavation, which meant that we collected lots more information and learned lots more than we had heretofore from a similar excavation. Well, the problem was, of course, what do you do with children at an ongoing excavation? And we really didn't know, and we sort of played it by ear. In this picture, you see the children with the rest of the staff up on the hilltop at Carpophora, and we're enjoying a morning coffee break, which we called colazzo, because there was some food, some tomatoes and bread and cheese and things of that sort, because we'd had our breakfast at 5 a.m. in order to be at the dig and starting work at 6. So the kids were there, and they wandered around. They observed what was going on in the various trenches and so on, as in this slide where Mara and Kevin are watching one of my old workmen from Pylos who'd come over on the bus to take a job here at this site. And here he is sieving, and they're watching to see what he's likely to come up with. We tried to preserve as much as possible a kind of family life on the site. We would have meals outside the tent on our little picnic table because we did not, at this stage, dine with the rest of the staff inside the excavation house. And you can see all the signs of a sort of al fresco existence, the wash basin there and the towels hanging on the tree to dry. Again, we had the rituals of not only around supper together, but also sort of the activities after supper, where I was accustomed to reading, and I brought a whole stack of children's books from England so that we would have plenty of reading material. And here's another, we had guests that would show up for our evening routines around the camper. In this case, a rabbit that has joined us, and we called the rabbit Anomaly, and I'll explain in a few minutes why he got that name. And here he's getting his supper while Kevin holds him, and Patricia tries to spoon feed the little rabbit. And we had other guests. Here, Kevin and Mara and I are playing cards, and all of a sudden a little girl showed up. I clearly didn't understand what was going on and what we were doing, but she was perfectly happy and very cheerful to sit and watch. And even when I was reading stories, she would show up and listen. We think that she's the daughter of a farmer who had the ground just below the hilltop here. You can see the water's edge down below, and we used to climb down and go through this farmer's fields in order to get to the edge of the water there and go swimming. So she came back up and joined us. On the weekends, since we didn't dig after noon on Saturday, why, we normally got away for the balance of Saturday and all day Sunday until evening, when we would come back after dinner. And we went to various hotels in the area because we needed a place where we could do all the laundry and all of us get showers and shampoos, and for Mara and Kevin, much better opportunities for swimming. So we would go. Here's Mara and Kevin at the beach down in Coroni, south of us, a gorgeous beach, which at that time was completely deserted. We never encountered, I think, another individual on this beach, which was very long and gorgeous sand, in the times we went down to Coroni. Well, this was, as I say, a dig where all sorts of new technologies were examined and tested and tried out. Here, Kevin is watching a couple that came and brought their balloon. One of the things that we were experimenting with was different ways to get photography of the sites and the remains that we were excavating from above, to give us a photographic ground plan. So Kevin was fascinated, and the Whittleseys were very happy to have Kevin around to participate in this. So the balloon is here, there getting ready, and here in this picture you see it starting its ascent, and Kevin and the other excavators are underneath, waiting for Whittlesey to trigger the radio-controlled camera underneath. The kinds of pictures we were after, here you see another balloon shot taken from high above Carpophore. You could see the ropes that connected the balloon in the upper left-hand corner. We even tried using Army helicopters that would come over, Greek aircraft that would come over and take pictures for us from helicopters. Another device that we tried was what we call the Bipod. It simply was an aluminum framework that would permit the camera to be hoisted high above what we wanted to photograph, but was used for lower elevations than the balloon. If we just wanted a photograph of a series of walls in a trench or something of that sort, that's what we use. Another new device was in the framework of the physicists. A professor from Oxford University came down to test this device, the Proton Magnetometer, which requires setting out a grid of metal posts across a field that you want to explore, and then taking readings, and the readings would show various degrees of resistance in the soil, which we would interpret. In this case, for example, you see there in the left-hand side a clear sign of a quite distinct difference, and it's not one, but two of them. These we would call anomalies, which gave us our name for the little bunny rabbit. And in this case, we would use this as a guide to excavation. So when we saw these two anomalies on this grid, we were interested in trying to open a trial trench to explore what these anomalies might be. Well, they were both right next to each other in a field which otherwise had no trace of anything that we were interested in. So we decided that we would explore, but one of them was right near the roots of a olive tree, and we had promised the owner of the field that we would not damage the tree. So we decided only to open a trench by one of these anomalies, And here you see what we found almost at once and why it was an anomaly. There were lots of rocks, lots of stones in this area which weren't around in the other parts of the field. Probably there was another one under that olive tree. We'll never know unless that tree is cut down and they excavate underneath. Well, we knew that this meant there was some human activity right here which left these stones in place, so we began to clear them. And almost at once, we uncovered evidence which showed us what we were into. And once again, I was back to digging graves. In this case, what emerges is there's a large ceramic vessel we call a pithos, and it's on its side, and it's been surrounded by these stones which form sort of a cairn over it in its original form. So the first thing to do was to begin to clear that pithos, and once again I had one of my old workmen help, the one we called Spholos, the little man, very short, very muscular, but just the kind of person we needed to work in a very confined space with very delicate things that have to be taken care of. So his first task was to clear the surface of the jar, the pithos, and here it is cleared. And we knew at once that it was a grave, that because it was reasonably common in this part of Greece to use these jars as a sort of sarcophagus. Not in the Bronze Age. This is a Dark Age, so we were much later than any of the Bronze Age remains that I had dug at Pylos. This grave was probably in that what we call the Greek Dark Ages, which extended from 1100 before the Common Era down to 700. As we will find out, this one comes closer to the end of that than the beginning. At any rate, we knew what we were dealing with. The question was, how do you deal with it? It was quite apparent, as you can see from this picture, that the jar was broken. As could be expected, these jars, the clay was very porous, they were thick-walled, they were extremely heavy, they were not cast on a wheel, obviously. It would throw the potter rather than the clay if you try to do that much clay on a potter's wheel. It was made in segments and then put together to form this, and it was usually sunk into the ground, that mouth towards the top, and it was used storage, usually for agricultural products. But after a death here, they used one of them, they dug it up and used it as their sarcophagus. So the only thing to do was to continue to break. We could not go in from the top. There wouldn't have been room to try to dig out the contents from the inside. We had to go down from above. So there was nothing for it but to remove the pieces of the jar and start to clear what was inside. And the first thing that turned up was a stone inside. The mouth, as you see, has been blocked by stones, but this was inside the jar. And the usual theory about the explanation for stones in that location is they were placed over the head of the deceased because families were afraid that the ghosts might get up and wander out if they were troubled or disturbed. So they put a stone right there over the head of the deceased to try to keep the dead spirit in place. Once the skeleton began to emerge, we realized that we had a fairly tall individual, his legs bent, and the body had been slid into the jar after death, after rigor mortis had set in, slid in probably, and immediately we began to notice there were some grave goods, some ceramic pieces, which again helped us to identify this as late in the geometric period. There were bronze items, a few, but quite remarkably, there was an iron sword under his leg. So again, we had every evidence that we were dealing with somebody died in the late Iron Age, and he was buried in this way. Now, at this period, the customs, there was not a common sort of culture. In the Bronze Age, in the late Bronze Age, we had seen the Mycenaean remains are basically similar all across the Greek world. The ceramics are very similar. Their burial customs are very similar. So that Blagin knew that I would find a chamber tomb cemetery near his palace because every other Mycenaean palace had had a chamber tomb cemetery nearby. But at this time in the Dark Ages, if we look at what was going on in Athens, we find that they were cremating their dead and burying the ashes, to be sure, in ceramics, but not a pithos. They had very fancy jars into which the ashes were placed. Here are some drawings of such a grave from the Keramikos, the burial ground near Athens itself, showing again late geometric pottery decorations on them. Now, what's interesting about the geometric period and the pottery designs is that for the first time we find pots that are inscribed with letters of the Greek alphabet. Back in the Bronze Age, they used that linear B script where each symbol stood for a sound, for a syllable. Whereas in the alphabetic system, as we know, you have to put letters together to create the sound and the syllable. So the Greeks had borrowed an alphabet from Mesopotamia, from the eastern end of the Aegean Sea, and the introduction was towards the end of the geometric period, and it begins to show up. As a matter of fact, Blagin was one of the ones who excavated some of the earliest of these inscribed vessels, and rather interestingly again, the very first one that could actually preserved a full text simply had an insult. It was named a man by the name of Nicomedes, and that he was, according to the inscription, he was gay, which was an insult. But most of those first examples show us scratched in on potsherds the alphabet, and they clearly were kind of a way of teaching Greeks how to make the letters of the alphabet. So you'd see a fragment that would have all the letters of the alphabet scratched in it, and then underneath another row of the same letters, and underneath that another row of the same letters as the young people tried to practice and learn how to write. This will give you an indication of why I think the Homeric poems were written down once and only once towards the end of the geometric period, just around 700 or shortly before. I think Homer was a person who wrote all this oral tradition down. The reason for that, there's several reasons, and we'll come back to them in, well, I think we probably should pause right here to discuss them because they have to do with the grave that we've just excavated. It's a grave of one immense person, isolated in a field where there are no traces of human habitation. What happened in the so-called Dark Ages after the destruction of the palace at Nestor and the other palaces like it is that there was a sudden catastrophic diminution of population in the Greek world. Something like 90% fewer people were living in the Dark Age than had been there during the Bronze Age. The current theory is that there must have been a climate change factor, namely a tremendous drought, which destroyed so many of the people in the eastern Mediterranean. Again, our excavation revealed a number of interesting things about it. As a result of this, all of a sudden the diet of the survivors changed, whereas the Mycenaeans had been great pastoralists with flocks of sheep and goats and cows, and lived on a diet heavy in cheese and vegetables and things of this sort, yogurt. The Dark Age people lived primarily on meat. They didn't raise their cows for dairy products, they slaughtered them for their meat. And our zoological specialist, Ardig, discovered that almost the entire species of wild deer that had once existed in this part of the Greek world were exterminated during the Dark Age, hunted to the verge of extinction. So there's quite clearly a tremendous difference between the two periods. Now, that warrior that we found, we'll call him a warrior, with his sword in the Pithos, he characterizes the culture of humanity during that Dark Age period. One had to have a strong man to defend his women, his children, his cattle, and his possessions. So that we had a series of sort of fortified households, a very unusual system given the Bronze Age cultures before it, where you have almost an urban culture around palaces. Here it was an isolated farmhouse by farmhouse by farmhouse, which is exactly the culture that we find reflected in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Individual warriors, each one filled with pride and trying to defend his or her own pride and establishment. So in the Odyssey, why the important thing is poor Penelope has been left behind without her man to defend her farmstead. So this is the difference. And it's just as well that we changed our methods of archaeological research to produce even more evidence at our site. But since I'm not going to go into a complete detailed study of that site, I might as well end with its ties to the Bronze Age, because that's what's led Bill McDonald to explore it. He thought it was a site mentioned in Linear B tablets, which apparently was a subordinate capital in the Mycenaean kingdom, or whatever it was. That center was in Pylos, where we found the palace. But at our site, we discovered that very little in the way of architecture survived. It definitely was occupied during the Bronze Age, but almost all traces of that Bronze Age habitation had been destroyed. We think now it was probably during the Turkish period that they decided to level the hilltop and scraped off much of what had been there before. So what we found were simply the foundations, the things that had been underground in the Mycenaean period. So I never found, for example, and I excavated the largest area at Nicoria of any trench master, I never had a single complete house plan that I could recover. In many ways, it was a very disappointing dig from a traditional archaeological point of view. We didn't have much in the way of architecture. We didn't have much in the way of elaborate finds. We had lots of pottery sherds, but very little in the way of complete and whole pots. Again, in that sense, it was disappointing as an excavation, although we got tremendous amounts of information as a result of it. But I want to close with the one thing that we did find, which is illustrates that even though things have changed, some things never change. We did find, and the picture that's on the screen right at the moment will show you what we found at one edge of the site, actually not on the Carpophora hilltop itself, but on a slope leading up to it, the remains of what clearly was a major tomb. Because here we are with a dromos leading towards, in this case, not a hollowed out cave that we would have had in a chamber tomb, but right above the end of that dromos, you can see a large block of stone. It's a lintel block, which would have been over the doorway leading in to a major tomb, the tholos type, which we usually think was confined to the royalty. So here we had a tomb. It was destroyed and much of it lost. You can see this is an artist's reconstruction of what it might have been like. And the only parts that were still extant are where you see on either side the stippling with little bits of broken rock that came from the upper parts of the tholos. At any rate, nothing to do but to dig it as much as we could. As you can see, part of the wall was still preserved. And when we got down to the floor, all of a sudden, look, there's an area that's darker colored than the rest of the floor of the tomb. Well, as a matter of fact, after we cleared it, we discovered there were more than one such places where a trench had been dug in the floor of the tomb, and obviously burial remains had been put into them. But unfortunately, in both these large trenches or pits, nothing was found that had not been thoroughly disturbed or robbed. So the tomb, the Great Tholos tomb, was basically a major disappointment, even though it was remarkable that it had survived at all. But all of a sudden, at the edge of the Tholos, there was a pit that hadn't been discovered by those who robbed the tomb. And here you can see why there's some things never change. Archaeologists too love to find a treasure. So everybody had to come around. Bill McDonald and all the staff that were there and the photographers to see what was in that pit. And what was in, obviously, were remains from earlier burials in the Tholos tomb that they wanted to keep in the tomb, but they didn't want them on the floor anymore. So you can see they're bent, they're dented, but these bronze remains of great cauldrons and embossed rims around the basins and things of that sort were simply put down in this pit and covered over with earth to make room for later burials. These are the items that went to the Olympia Museum almost at once for preservation and for study. So we ended up with a treasure after all, but we had found so much more in the years that we worked there. Now what had happened was in 1968, while I was directing the summer session, all of a sudden one afternoon, Bill McDonald from the University of Minnesota stopped by and said, would I be willing to participate in this excavation? And I said, yes, but only on one condition. My wife and children have to come with me. So he agreed. So for the first time, as I said, we had a family together. But in 1972, all of a sudden we had a serious accident. Our faithful Volkswagen had been used by Patricia, who was directing the excavation house and the supplying of food to all those excavators. And she was using our Volkswagen to go to and fro from the stores and shops and over to Kalamata and bring back groceries and meat and whatever for the operation. And one it was actually fairly close to the end of the season, but still a month away. While coming back from the village with both Kevin and Mara aboard and the groceries, a cement truck coming around a curve and swerved over into her lane, hit the Volkswagen, and put an end to our activities in the way we had been up to that time. All of a sudden, Patricia had a fractured pelvis. Mara ran to warn the people at the excavation house, and Kevin stayed with his mother, and I was up on the hilltop at Carpafora when the message reached me that I was needed back at the excavation house. Patricia had a fractured pelvis, and it turned out the only solution to that is bed rest. So she moved into the excavation house and had a bed where she recovered. And the children and I were out in the camper and in the tent as usual, but now we had to take our meals all together with the rest of the staff in the excavation house. And that winter, Bill McDonald said he couldn't risk another such experience, and so he didn't want us to come back. So we missed the summer of 1973. 74 was the study season, and I went back just for a short time while Patricia and Kevin were with friends in England to finish my report. And so that was the end of my field work and our experience.